Hello, I'm John Gree from Classical Historian, and I'm very happy to be here to bring you the Modern American History book. This is our book club meeting one. Our units will be on Reconstruction and Going West. But first, a quick introduction to why I wrote this book. With Classical Historian, for many years, we were using an American history book for junior high students written by Edward Eggleston, published in 1888, because we wanted to use a book with a traditional historical perspective that showed America as a Judeo-Christian country, and a book that was written for public school kids. But none existed. So, about 7 or 8 years ago, I met authors Larry Schweikart and Mike Allen, who authored a Patriot's History of the United States, and I asked them to recommend me a junior high or high school book written with that same perspective as their Patriot's History book. They told me that there is none in existence, and that they tried to get their publishers to support such a book, but their publishers wouldn't do that. And so Larry and Mike told me that I had to write it. I told them that I would write one if one of them would be my history editor. And so Mike Allen edited Story of Liberty, which was published about 7 years ago, 2017, 2018. And that has been a very successful book over the years. But parents and teachers kept telling me I have to write a modern version of the book. And so that has been the labor that I've been going through for the past 5 or 6 years to write this modern American history reconstruction through the Reagan Revolution. Now, like I see American history is not the story of a half-empty cup, but the American cup is nearly full. And it is a great story. It's a positive story that Americans have really forgotten. Now, my history books show the good, the bad, and the ugly of American history, but they also show American history as promoting Western civilization, a Judeo-Christian society, limited government, free market, and peace through strength, and really highlighting the greatness of America and showing American students that there is so much to be proud of, that we live in the greatest country in the world, the United States of America. So there are 3 books that Classical Historian publishes on American history: Early American History, Modern American History, and then a combination of the two, American History. These 2 shorter books are meant for junior high students, and this American History book is meant for high school students. But it really depends upon the educator, the parent, the state, the teacher, which content they want to focus on, and choosing one of these 3. So let's get right into Unit 1, Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. However, some historians say it continued all the way through the 1900s. Now, in this time period of Reconstruction, after the Civil War, of course, radical Republicans wanted to rebuild the South, where Black Americans enjoyed civil rights, where Republicans were dominant, and where the South would never rise. Keep in mind a couple of little known facts. At the beginning of the Civil War, there was not one Republican in the country who owned a slave. Never heard that before? Well, think about why you've never heard that before. It is the truth. You can look it up. Ulysses S. Grant had owned slaves, but then he changed parties and became a Republican and gave up his slave. The only slave owners in America at the time were Democrats. They wanted to have slaves. Now, after the Civil War, the Southern white Democrat politicians were not in their state legislatures, and Republicans then really controlled the House, the Senate, and the president. So they wanted to remake America so it would be a free place. How do they do? Well, in the first phase of Reconstruction, we can call it presidential Reconstruction, and it begins with the magnanimous Lincoln, right? The very generous Lincoln, who already in 1863 issued an amnesty proclamation saying that if Southerners would ask that they would be forgiven for rebelling against the North, and their states would be allowed back in. Um, he had a few small requirements. Basically, if 10% of the state would agree to be loyal and to take a loyalty oath, the entire state would be readmitted into the Union. Lincoln was responsible in part for getting the 13th Amendment passed. Okay. It did eventually take place later that year in 1865, but he wanted slavery to end. The Republicans wanted slavery to end, and they got it. It passed. 13th Amendment passed in 1865. It's kind of crazy how some people say that Lincoln really didn't care if there was slavery or not. But then you have this fact of him working so hard on this amendment. And on April 14th, 1865, he was assassinated. So presidential Reconstruction plan was basically taken over by his vice president, Andrew Johnson. Now, Johnson felt very strongly that Black people were inferior to whites, and he did not care about granting Blacks equal rights with whites or voting rights. And so Johnson and the Republican Congress butted heads for the entire time, and Congress attempted to impeach and remove Johnson. They almost succeeded, but they were one vote short in kicking him out of office. Now, during this time period, there was such a thing called the Freedmen's Bureau, which established schools throughout the country to teaching the new freedmen, the former Black American slaves, teaching them basic education and also how to survive in the country. And there was hope that the government would be giving freed slaves 40 acres and a mule. There were many problems during presidential Reconstruction, mainly because there was no enforcement mechanism to force the white Southern Democrats to treat Black Americans with equality. The KKK, a radical white terrorist organization, formed in December 24th, 1865, right? Christmas Eve night in Tennessee. It was headed by a former Confederate general. And their idea was to promote terror among the Black American population, so they would never want to have equal rights with whites, and they would be afraid. So there were massacres of Black Americans, lynchings, which is illegal hangings without trial. And from 1882 to 1968, there were over 3,446 Black Americans lynched. So this presidential Reconstruction, yes, the 13th Amendment passed, and that was huge. That was a great success. Slavery no longer existed in America. But as far as the other goals of Reconstruction, it was more of a failure. Okay, Blacks did not have equal rights. There was no enforcement mechanism to force that upon the South. We then enter into this period of congressional Reconstruction, 1866 through the mid 1870s. Now, in this time period, the radical Republicans were able to enforce their will and pass many laws and two amendments as well. One law was the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to force the Southerners to give Black Americans their rights. The 14th Amendment passed. This amendment granted citizenship to anyone who was born in the United States of America. And so all slaves who had been born, all freedmen who had been born in the United States were instantly citizens. And the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867, which split the South into 5 military districts. And with the military there, the Republicans were able to force the South to go along with these ideas and with these policies. In 1866, hundreds of thousands of Black Americans voted for the first time. Black congressmen were voted into Congress. And also at this time period, white Southerners boycotted the elections. So yes, And congressional Reconstruction had some great successes with Black Americans voting, but without buy-in from over 50% of the population, also, it's hard to call this time period a great success because it wasn't accepted by a majority of the population who lives there. Now, Grant was elected in 1868 as well. He was a um, Republican. So you had a Republican Congress, you had a Republican president, and they passed the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote to all citizens. Now, during this time period, government grew at a pace and volume that it had never grown before. You have, right, military, federal military in the South. You have money going towards the Freedmen's Bureau. You have this new Civil Rights Act of 1866. So the federal government is getting bigger to enforce these good things for equal rights. But wherever government grows, corruption grows as well because there's more money for politicians to mess with. And so during the Grant presidency, there was a good amount of corruption, which put really a shadow over this congressional Reconstruction time period. All right. Now, in 1876, there was a very close election between the Republican candidate Hayes and the Democrat candidate Tilden. It appeared that Tilden had won. However, there were some problems in counting the votes and the electoral votes. And so a compromise was reached between the Republican Party and the Democrat Party. The compromise was Hayes, the Republican, would become the president, and the United States Army would move out of the South, and that would end the military occupation of the South. That was in 1876. So once the Army left, there was the federal troop withdrawal. Once the Army left in the South, then the white Southern Democrats began the reign of terror, okay? Known as the Mississippi Plan. They used violence, groups such as the Ku Klux Klan or KKK, and also other groups, one of them called the Red Shirts. They used lynchings, intimidation, other horrible acts of terror committed against Black American girls and women, and also Black men. And you here have a KKK guy in a robe here, this image shaking the hand of a Southerner with a gun. And you have here a Black American family cowering in fear. Okay. So really just a horrible, horrible time. The Redeemer phase meant that they're redeeming or going back to ways that existed before the Civil War. Of course, not slavery, but everything else. And then terribly, in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that segregation was constitutionally protected. Of course, segregation meant that there were separate public facilities for whites and separate public facilities for Blacks. So you had schools for Black kids, schools for white kids. And the Supreme Court said, yes, as long as they're equal, it's fine. But in reality, what it looked like was that the white schools, the white facilities were always the best or the better. And the Black schools and the Black facilities were in very bad shape, very bad condition. And that you had a two-tiered society in the South. And in all private facilities like restaurants and things like that, owners could say Blacks are not allowed inside. And so Blacks were considered second-class citizens. And very quickly after this 1876 election, no Black Americans could vote in the South. It was just impossible to do that. So Reconstruction, the good. The slaves were freed. During this time period, also Congress passed the Homestead Act of 1862 and 1866, which allowed for whites and Blacks to receive 160 acres as long as they were able to work on that land for 5 years and improve it. So Black Americans did not get the free 40 acres and a mule from the Freedmen's Bureau, but they had the opportunity to get 160 acres for free if they would work on the land for 5 years. So by 1900, 25% of all Southern landowners were Black. And there were some successful Black Americans in the South. So there were some great successes with Reconstruction, including the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. But there were some great failures as well. Most Black Americans sharecropped, and although some were able to be successful in this endeavor where they worked on land owned by a former slave owner, perhaps, or just a rich white person who owned the land, and they gave part of their crop to the owner, and they were able to sell part of the other crop. Although there were some successes, there were also many failures, and also many instances where the sharecropper had to kind of, for his life, pay back the money and property and things that he owed the landowner. And so he was kind of like in a horrible situation, working on land that he did not own and always getting more and more in debt. There was an incredibly horrible reign of terror in the South that reigned after Reconstruction ended. And there was a great growth of federal government, which meant less liberty and also more corruption. And so Reconstruction was partially successful in getting Black Americans rights as citizens, voting rights, all economic rights. But it was also, it looks like, in many parts, more unsuccessful because of the reign of terror in the South, segregation, and the growth of federal government. So kind of 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps back. We next go to our next unit, going west, 1860 to 1893. Okay, so only about one generation, this 30-year time period, which is so big in the ideological mindset or picture of an American. When he thinks of his country, many times he thinks of images from the West. This is a beautiful, romanticized version of Americans moving west here. And you have here the Rocky Mountains and the picturesque scenery. And let's go ahead and talk about this. There were many ways to get west. The most traveled and maybe the least expensive was by land. Okay, you have here the different trails that people took, and these weren't roads; they were more just kind of like routes that people took. And amazingly, that on some of these routes are still the ruts that the wagon wheels left. If you were to go there and look on the ground, you could see the wagon wheels that people left traveling there. This happened over, now it's what, let's say 1860, and now right in the 21st century, over 150 years ago. You had the Oregon Trail going to the great farmland up here, the Mormon Trail ending up in Utah, the California Trail down here. You have the Old Spanish Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, and the Gila Trail. So families attempted to leave. Missouri was a popular leaving point. For the Mormon Trail, it was in Nauvoo, Illinois, and they left early spring. And the goal was to get over the Rocky Mountains before winter set in. Okay, so maybe leaving in March or so and trying to get over the Rockies before November. And tens of thousands of families were successful in doing so. Of course, the worst scenario, the worst example of families failing was the Donner Pass, where a group of families took a route that they believed was a shortcut. In fact, nobody had ever tried the route before. It was falsely written and advertised, and they got stuck in the mountains, and many of them died, and unfortunately, some resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. Okay, so really very tough conditions going west, but Americans were hungry for the land out there. The Homestead Act guaranteed them those 160 acres if they worked on it for 5 years. And really, this opportunity did not exist elsewhere in the world. An average person, a citizen, could get 160 acres, which was considered enough to support a family. It was just an incredible opportunity and it really like ignited the world. People from around the world immigrated into America to take advantage of this opportunity to own private property, right? To have your own house as your own castle. And I think it's part of the American dream and vision of even our founding fathers who weren't involved in the Homestead Act. Of course, they had all died, but they all kind of viewed America as a future land of individual farm owners. Thomas Jefferson believed that that would happen. He thought it would take 1,000 years to go across the West to the Pacific Ocean, but it took less than 100 from his time period, just because the world was excited about liberty, economic opportunity, the free market, private property. Okay, so by land was one of the ways to go west. Another route, which was more expensive, was the sailboat, and then after 1849, the steamboat. Okay, you could take a route that would go to the Isthmus of Panama, hike across this area, get on another boat to go to the San Francisco, Sacramento area. Now, Panama, this little isthmus, contained a lot of diseases. And so many people died doing this. The other route, which was more popular, although more treacherous by sea, was the Cape Horn route, right? Going all the way down to the tip of South America and back up again. And the Cape Horn has really dangerous winds and ocean. And so that was challenging. But I think this was considered even safer than this other route. So in the beginning, this difference of sailing by steamboat, by 1849, it took about 2 months to make this trip. In the early 1800s, it took about 6 months to make this trip. Okay, so sailboat and steamboat. And then after 1869, it was possible to go across the country by train. It became less expensive to do so, faster, and safer. And we kind of all know the story of the Transcontinental Railroad, this line right here, where Congress had passed a law to give the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad, give them money per mile of track that these two companies laid. So for every mile of track, the company would receive a certain amount of money. Also, the government gave them the land adjoining both sides of the railway, so that those companies could sell that land and get more money that way. And the companies also received mineral rights. So if gold were found or silver or some type of iron ore, then the railroad companies would own that land. Now, you can imagine the incentive to cheat. And the companies took advantage of this by making the rail lines not straight as possible, or not the quickest way, but really the longest way. And it was taking so long and they were not going so straight that General Grant said if they didn't meet by this particular date, he was not going to give them any of the money. And so within about 3 weeks of that time, they finally met here in a place called Promontory, Utah. Now, this railway line, known as the Transcontinental Railroad, the meeting of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, in 10 years, this became bankrupt. Now, the reason why is because they had been given so much money by the federal government that these railways were inefficient, and they became top heavy, where the leaders were just trying to get a quick buck. Now, there's another transcontinental railroad that is not as well known, and that is the Great Northern Railway, which you see right here. Now, this railroad up here, the Great Northern Railway, was built by James J. Hill. He was an entrepreneur, and he took no government subsidies to build his railway, wanted in the most efficient railway, the best run railway. And guess what? He was extremely successful. His company did not go bankrupt in 10 years, but ran a great, efficient railway, did not need any help from the government. And we've never maybe heard this before, right? You never heard about this, but this is kind of one of the unknown facts of the American movement westward, powered by entrepreneurialism and free market, okay? Where you have minimum or no amount of government subsidies, and greatness comes about that because people want to make money, they want to serve the public the best they can, and they make sure that the products that they serve are good. So James J. Hill, the Great Northern Railway. Now, there were great, abundant natural resources in America at that time and now as well. You had the fur industry. This is little beaver there. You had fishing. This is a salmon. You had the logging industry and mining. And each of these four industries, Larry Schweikart and Mike Allen from A Patriot's History note that there was a common pattern followed in how Americans used these resources. First, individuals went out and hunted the beaver or salmon or mined on their own or logged timber. And then larger companies moved in with greater capital and mined these in great amounts. Then, very often, if especially things were done on public land, there became a loss of these resources, a loss of beaver. Maybe there was overhunting beaver or overhunting salmon. And so there was an effort made to conserve, especially on privately owned property, because the business owners did not want to run out of wood for paper, for example, or for wood. They would plant trees that they would cut down. However, on public lands where there were great government subsidies, there was really no incentive to conserve. And so you saw this pattern happen. And once again, on government property where subsidies were, or where no one owned those, there was no need to conserve, no rush to conserve. However, on private land, there was. And so one example of this is Frederick Weyerhaeuser. He owned a great logging company, and the logs, of course, were used for making homes, buildings, and for paper. And he established in the 1800s the first Forest Service, hiring hundreds of forest rangers. This was before the United States had their own forest agency. And for every tree that his company cut down, they planted 5 new ones. And so he was able to conserve the logs, the trees. And what's an amazing thing is you could look up this company today. It exists. It's very successful today. It's the same company that Frederick Weyerhaeuser started. And it's just a great testament, once again, to the free market. And what's amazing is that in America today, we have many times the more trees than we did when our country was founded in 1776. So there actually has been a great deal of conservation happening in the United States of America. Now, during this time period, 1865 to 1888, we have the era of the cowboy. Now, picture an Olympic Games beginning ceremony. It's very common that the American team are all wearing cowboy hats. Many of them have cowboy boots on. Now, most Americans don't grow up in an area where there are a bunch of horses or cowboys, but this era of the cowboy is so big in the mind of Americans that it really defines who we are. And what happened was that during the Civil War, many of the Southern men were off fighting, and the cows that they had been raising were roaming free throughout the land. When they came back in 1865, America had grown. There was a great need for beef to feed America. And there were these hundreds of thousands of cows roaming the countryside. Now, there was one type of cow called the Texas Longhorn, and it had a problem. The Texas Longhorn very often was infested with a tick. And if you mixed Texas Longhorns with other cattle, that tick would spread and it would kill the cow. But cowboys discovered Or others discovered that if you brought the cows to an area where the temperature was freezing overnight, the ticks died. And so a great movement came where cowboys were hired to round up the cows and to bring them north where the ticks would freeze at nighttime, and then bring them to these cow towns. Now, at these cow towns, Denver, Dodge City, Ellsworth, Abilene, Kansas City, St. Joseph, Sedalia, St. Louis, at these cow towns were train stations that brought the cows to Chicago, to the meat packing plants where uh, the cows would be killed and slaughtered and cut up. And so all of these trails had different names: the Chisholm Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail, the Western Trail, the Shawnee Trail. Um, so really, this cowboy era was all about cowboys working to bring the cows north, okay, to the railway stations. And it only happened for about 23 years, 25 years or so. So the cowboy was known for being a rugged individual. He was typically a young male, age 16 to about 30. He was physically strong. He was physically tough. He could fight with his fists. Of course, he was an excellent horse rider, and he had a Texas accent. And you will still see people with this kind of country accent, not just in Texas, but throughout much of the Midwest, all throughout the Southwest as well. Now, he would ride the horse and move the cows along, protecting them from uh, bandits trying to steal cows, or maybe from wild animals. He would sleep at night using his saddle for his pillow. And following following the cows and the cowboys was the chuck wagon, which was a wagon where there was a cook cooking cowboy food like stew, right? There was abundant amount of beef to be used. So the cowboy ate a great deal of beef. Now, much has been said about the Wild West, and a lot of movies have been made about this time period, right? How dangerous the Wild West was. But amazingly, um, modern cities such as Los Angeles or Chicago or New York City, or very recently Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia, had higher crime rates for murder and especially for rape. Okay. In the Wild West, you didn't really have that type of crime. And what's amazing is that the gun was so easily able to be bought. Anybody could buy a gun. You could even buy a gun by mail order and bullets. So back then, of course, there was no Amazon, but there were catalogs where people would order things from 1,000 miles away, and they would come in the mail. You could buy a gun that way. Guns were readily available, but really, compared to today, it wasn't violent. But everybody also, many of these cowboys, of course, all had guns and they all knew how to use them. Maybe for that reason, nobody wanted to mess with them. So the cowboy era, what ended it? Now, about the year 1887, 1888, there were two winters that were incredibly horrible, and they killed tens of thousands of cows because it was just too cold. So that's one thing that ended it. Another thing that ended it was that farmers didn't want the cowboys to be moving the cows across their farms. And so something was created that the cows would not go through. And it was barbed wire, right? There's wire with these barbs sticking out of it. And farmers set those up around their farms. And so within a couple years, the era of the cowboy ended. But it has never ended, I guess, in the dreaming or the philosophy or the mindset of the American, and also of people in the world. You have people in the world imagining Americans as cowboys. No, so we turn to a unit which is the greatest stain on American history, and that is the end of the trail for the American Indians. And this is an artistic work done, shows a brave warrior uh, dying on his horse. Okay. And so we have this end of the trail for the life of the American Indian. Now, from the very beginning, we have a clash of two cultures, right? The Western Judeo-Christian European American culture and the American Indian culture that really, for many reasons, um, did not exist together. And Schweikart again, Larry Schweikart and Mike Allen, who wrote A Patriot's History of the United States, noticed that there's a pattern when these two cultures clashed. Initially, there was a peaceful exchange of goods and ideas. Then there was conflict over land and resources. And third, Indian defeat with either extermination of the Indians or expulsion. And finally, in the 1890s, late 1800s, there was complete defeat of the American Indians, moving them onto reservation and very slow assimilation. So one thing I'd like to just talk about first is this false idea of the noble savage myth. And there's kind of an idea out there in recent times that the American Indian was perfect, did not lie, never stole, never cheated. And this is highly simplified and not true. Now, there were over 300 American Indian tribes when the Europeans first set foot onto what would become the United States of America. And each Indian tribe had its own custom, its own culture, its own way of living. Some Indian tribes used stealing as a way of proving manhood. So the Indians of the Northeast, the woodland Indians, a young boy was taught that he had to steal from another tribe to become a man. And if he were caught, he would be tortured, slowly tortured to death. There was wife stealing within tribes. And many of the Indian women were treated no better than sex slaves. So that's not very noble. Torture was allowed. Also, if a woman was caught by the Iroquois Federation, she was raped. Okay. And not once, but maybe for life. You have, very violent tribes such as the Comanche, and you have a sense of great inequality among Indians. You had to hunt in the hunting tribes, or you were not respected at all. And then there were some tribes that were all farming tribes, the Navajo and many tribes of California and the Southwest, and they had a completely different set of ideas. And so this noble savage myth did not exist. And kind of a crazy story too is that there's this myth that the Indians, when they killed the buffalo, they would use every single part of the buffalo and not let any of it go to waste. That is not true. It is true they would use all parts of the buffalo, but let's say that the American Indians needed some buffalo hide to make their teepees. So they might kill many buffalo, take off their hides, and leave the meat to rot. That might happen. So there are places in the West where there are mountains of buffalo bones left over as kind of proof that the American Indians did not use every single part of the buffalo. And as well, there were eyewitnesses, Westerners, eyewitnesses, who wrote of coming across giant herds of buffalo just left to rot, buffalo flesh, and that they had seen American Indians kill them. So this is not true. Now, this does not in any way diminish the horrors that the Americans and American government inflicted upon Indians. Okay. Just because the American Indians were not perfect or were not completely noble, it doesn't mean what the Americans did was any better. No, it doesn't mean that. But it's good to know the good, the bad, and the ugly of every culture. And every culture has the good, the bad, and the ugly. So after the Civil War and during part of it, we have the Plains Indian Wars, which were really kind of the last big amount of wars. Americans forced Indians onto the reservations during this time period. Atrocities were committed against the Indians. You have the massacre at Sand Creek in Colorado, which was perpetrated by civilians, right? American civilians massacring Indians. And then you have General Pope hanging 38 warriors who surrendered. And then you have one tiny victory of the Indians and called the Battle of Little Bighorn, where inexplicably General George Custer divided his soldiers, divided his army, and went after the Indians with only 275 cavalry. Okay, and he was destroyed. They completely killed him out. But it's the only instance really where we know in the 1800s where the Indians made such a great victory, and it's because Custer divided his army. And terribly, we have kind of the last massacre of the Americans against the Indians called the Wounded Knee Massacre in South Dakota in 1890, okay, where the Americans were disarming the Indians. A shot went off, and the American military moved in and murdered 250 American Indian men, women, and children. There were also about 40 American soldiers who were killed as well. But really just kind of a horrible situation of Americans mistreating the Indians in a really difficult situation with these cultures clashing, and really a great stain on Americans. So let's just talk a little bit about the Indians. One of the policies that was talked about was extermination, that they should be all killed, all wiped out. Now, America was a predominantly Christian society, and so that was not possible. That was not going to happen. Americans were not going to kill the American Indians. And then another one was to assimilate American Indians. However, some of the American Indians, like the Comanche and the Apache, were ferocious and had practices such as torture and rape. And how could you really try to assimilate those people without fighting them? Kind of really impossible, because they were not going to give up. And so this idea emerged of a reservation system where American Indians would have their own property within the United States, and they would not be subject to state law. They would be subject to federal law. And so that is what emerged, and that is what we have today, where there are places of Indian rule, Indian reservation within the federal government. And over time, over 100 years or so, 150 years, life for American Indians have improved. They have been slowly assimilating into Western culture, into the idea of working. And there are many places where Indians run successful reservations and are doing very well. However, it still is a troubled history and a troubled presence that all Americans are still coping with today. So the end of the frontier happened about 1890, 1900. The United States really had been settled. America was a world power, but it was not yet recognized as one, and it kind of did not see itself as one as well. So this opportunity to own land really inspired people from around the world to move to America, the freedom, the liberty that it offered. There was the cowboy era, and of course, there was a tragic end of the trail for the American Indians. I'm John Gree from Classical Historian. This recording will be available in the Dolphin Society, which is our teacher membership service. And there we have over 5 years of book club summaries where you can go and get a quick summary of American history, world history, and different important historical events. I want to thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you next time.